Hey, Jonathan Peters here with an edition of Big Heads, Big Ideas. And so this last week I was really thinking about the format, the different methods of delivery. So instructor-led, e-learning, and all the different variations there. And whenever we start to talk about technology and learning, we have to realize that this brain of ours has been learning long before we had any type of technology. If you Even the ancient parts of our brains were learning long before we ever developed cortex, so cerebral cortex and so on. So we were learning survival skills and so on. This brain long before it had all this thinking part of the brain. But when we think about more traditional learning as we define it now, and you have to realize that we had language at least 70,000 years ago when humans first started forming societies. We probably had it long before then, the capacity for language and speaking long before we started gathering together, perhaps as far back as 1.6 million years ago, because all humans have the capacity for language. So that suggests this was a trait that we developed before the Great Migration out of Africa. So when you're thinking about all that time and all that learning, and then realize that it was this text and technology, our brains developed a long time before we got to that point. So for instance, the first alphabet wasn't invented till 1800 BCE, so not that long ago. I mean, several thousand years ago. But the point is that that's none of us were reading before then. Our brains had been thinking and learning for a long time before that development. Then most of us, of course, didn't start reading till 1436 after the Gutenberg Press was created. So even then, when we're looking at it, the interaction with words is a relatively new thing for our brains to deal with. But now let's move it to e-learning. And the first true e-learning program, program alternative to instructor-led, let's say, was in 1960. So it's still people alive today that were alive in 1960, certainly. And it was the University of Illinois. It was called Plato program. It stood for something. It was for teaching computer skills on the mainframe computer. So it wasn't much of an advantage over VILT type, or not VILT, but instructor-led training, because everybody still had to be connected to the mainframe. So, and it wasn't until the 1990s that any concept of e-learning really took hold, of course, with the personal computer, but also there's a new invention called CD-ROMs. So they could send CDs in the mail and you could watch it on your computer program, because our modems back then didn't have the bandwidth to do anything significant when it comes to learning. But still, 1990s, that's all pretty recent for our brain. So to understand that anything that's tech-based, our brains really haven't developed the capacity for it yet. So you might say, well, the big head must be saying that instructor-led is the best way to go. Well, of course, the problem with that is it's not scalable. It requires students to be sitting there with with the teacher. And so that has its own limitations. So there's finding that balance in between. But here's the kicker. It turns out that the hybrid, okay, where it's both e-learning and the instructors there, whether VILT or in person, it turns out hybrid learning is significantly more effective than either version by itself. So it's significantly better than just instructor-led, and certainly better than just e-learning. And so starting to think about how can you do this with your learning. And the concept, the idea is this, is because students are learning at their own speed and going into the depth at the depths that they want to. So it gives them individuality, puts them in charge of their learning, and that seems to be what makes the difference and why hybrid learning is so much better than the other options. So give that some thought. I'd love to hear your comments. It's bighead at sententiagames.com, and do subscribe to this series down below. Thank you.